October 28th, 1945, 5:37 p.m. A white farmhouse 2 miles east of Camp Atterbury, Indiana. Steam fogged the kitchen windows, turning the late October dusk into a blur of brown fields and bare corn stalks. The air inside was thick with heat from the enamel gas range, and the sweet, almost cloying smell of baked ketchup and beef. Nakamura Yumi sat straight-backed at the long oilcloth-covered table, hands folded in her lap, wrists still faintly indented where the transport cuffs had rubbed on the train from the camp. The U.S. military police sergeant stood behind her shoulder, his web belt creaking softly when he shifted, the worn butt of his M1 carbine resting against his thigh. On the table, the loaf lay in its metal pan like a brick of dark meat, capped with a glossy red glaze. Beside it, a wooden-handled carving knife caught the yellow light from the bare bulb. Each metallic clink of the blade against the pan made her shoulders tighten. Helen Miller, in a flowered apron faded at the seams, smiled as she cut. "Meatloaf," she said, as if naming something obvious and harmless, "with ketchup on top. Everybody likes this." The first slice slumped onto Yumi's plate, red glaze streaking onto the mashed potatoes like a spill. The sweetness hit her nose, sugar and vinegar and something metallic, and for a moment it was the smell of burned syrup in a field hospital tent, masking blood. Her stomach clenched. "Too sweet," she murmured in Japanese before she could stop herself. Helen paused, knife hovering. Then she laughed, not unkindly. "Well then, honey," she said, reaching for the pepper shaker, "put a little fire on it. If you're listening from another country, imagine what this table would taste like to you." 10 days earlier, Camp Atterbury POW compound, Indiana. The train shuddered to a halt with a long metallic sigh, and silence rushed into the carriage where the women had been swaying for days. For a moment, Yumi thought it was another sighting, another forgettable stop in a country that had blurred into endless fields and chimneys. Then she heard shouted English, closer than before, and the clank of couplers being unlatched. The MP at the door slid it open. Cold air knifed in, carrying the smell of wet leaves and coal smoke. Beyond the doorway, the world was flat and gray, bare trees, muddy ground, low wooden buildings, and, cutting the horizon, 2 lines of barbed wire and a guard tower with a dark figure inside. "Out! Single file!" the MP barked. His words were drilled into Yumi's ears now. She didn't need the army interpreter further down the car to know what came next. She rose first. Her knees trembled from the stiff benches, but she kept her back straight as she stepped down the metal ladder to the cinder-crushed earth. The others followed, clutching their meager bundles, eyes flicking between the rifles and the tower. "Camp Atterbury," the interpreter said in slow Japanese, pointing to a painted sign she couldn't read. "A training post. A prison for enemy soldiers. Another piece of America that had once only been a rumor on war maps." Yumi forced her gaze to move deliberately. The wooden barracks with their tar paper roofs, the high double fence, the searchlights caged in metal. Guards in olive drab wool and steel helmets stood with M1 carbines slung at their shoulders, boots dark with mud. "Work details," the interpreter added. "Farms, under the convention." Farms. The word landed wrong in her head, too soft for the harshness of wire and guns. She nodded, as if she understood. Behind her, she felt the group waver, a small tremor in the line of bodies, and she tightened her jaw. They would not see them shake. The truck smelled of old canvas, diesel, and damp wool. Yumi sat on the wooden bench along the side, knees pressed to the crate at her feet, one hand on the slat to steady the woman next to her whenever the deuce and a half lurched over a rut. The tailgate was up, but the October wind still found its way in, needling through their thin overcoats. Through the narrow gap between canvas and tailgate, the camp fences fell away. The land opened into flat fields cut by fence posts and drainage ditches. Rows of corn stood half-harvested, stalks ragged and pale. It should have felt like freedom, Yumi thought. Instead, the emptiness made her skin prickle. There was nowhere to hide out here, nowhere to gather oneself before a voice barked an order. The truck slowed, gears grinding. As it turned into a gravel drive, she glimpsed a white farmhouse with peeling paint, a red barn, a small silo. 2 boys on bicycles had stopped at the road, staring. One raised his hand, not in greeting, but to his mouth, shouting something she couldn't catch over the engine. She heard only one sharp word: Jap. The MP sergeant in the truck bed shifted, hand resting on the stock of his carbine. "Eyes front," he snapped. Yumi's spine obeyed before the words reached her mind. They climbed down into a yard of packed dirt and straw. A dog barked furiously until a woman's voice cut through. The woman, apron, hair pinned in a loose knot, stepped down, wiping her hands on the fabric. She moved with the easy efficiency Yumi recognized from hospital wards. Samoa guard pointed. "This is Mrs. Miller. You work for her. You understand?" The interpreter repeated in Japanese. Yumi bowed slightly, eyes lowering, but not all the way. Behind her, one of the younger women fumbled with a pitchfork, grabbing it too near the tines. Yumi turned, adjusting the grip with a quick, quiet touch, angling the handle so the weight balanced. When she looked up, Helen Miller was watching her. Not with fear, not quite with anger, but with the measuring gaze of someone deciding whether a tool would hold or snap. "Put her by the barn," Helen said to the sergeant. "She looks like she knows what she's doing." Yumi did not know what that meant yet, only that the barn, and whatever waited inside it, had just claimed her. By mid-afternoon, the barn had gone quiet. The animals lulled into a dozy stillness. Dust floated in slanting light from the high windows, turning every movement into a small disturbance. Yumi stacked the last of the feed sacks, palms burning through the rough cotton gloves the camp had issued. Outside, a truck rattled away down the lane. The MP sergeant leaned against the barn door, carbine slung low, cigarette cupped in his hand against the wind. From the direction of the house came the faint clatter of dishes, the creak of a screen door. Helen appeared a minute later, carrying an enamelware mug in each hand. Steam curled up into the chill air, carrying the thin, bitter smell Yumi had come to associate with American mornings. "I brought coffee," Helen said, stopping just inside the barn. She glanced at the sergeant. "For them too. It's cold." The sergeant frowned. "Mrs. Miller, there's regulations," he began. "Regulations don't say they can't drink something hot on a day like this," she cut in. Her voice was tired, not sharp. The interpreter was not there. The words washed over Yumi as sounds, not meaning, but the offer was clear enough when Helen held out a mug toward her, handle first. The metal rim was chipped, blue along the edge. A swirl of pale liquid sloshed inside, weakly brown. Small, a harmless thing. Yumi hesitated. To sit, to drink, to share the same bitter warmth as these people felt like stepping onto a floor she could not see. She bowed slightly instead, hands at her sides. "I kekko desu," she said softly. "No, thank you." Helen's gaze dropped to Yumi's hands, to the ridged pale scars along her knuckles where disinfectant and endless washing had cracked the skin back on Saipan. Something flickered there. Recognition or resentment, Yumi could not tell. The sergeant exhaled smoke through his nose. "Suit yourself," he muttered. Helen shifted the mug to her other hand, the offered warmth folding back toward her. Across the yard, in the farmhouse window, a square of cloth with a single gold star stirred in the draft. Yumi saw it only as color and shape. But the way Helen's eyes lingered there told her the coffee had been more than a drink. The days found their shape quickly. At dawn, The truck from camp rolled up the lane, brakes sighing, and the women climbed down into the cold. Breath smoked from their mouths as they crossed the yard to the barn, boots crunching frost that turned the dirt yard pale. By mid-morning, the chill gave way to a damp animal warmth, hog breath, sour hay, the metallic tang of manure and rusted iron. Yumi learned the rhythm of the feedings. Scoop from the burlap sack, swing the dented bucket, pour into the long metal troughs. The hogs jostled and squealed, pink backs heaving against one another. The sound blurred, if she let it, into the roar of generators and the rising whine of aircraft engines on Saipan. She focused on the small things to hold the present steady. The weight of the bucket in her hands, the pattern of nail heads in the barn planks, the way light from a high window cut a bright square on the packed earth. When one of the younger women lagged, she shifted over silently to help, smoothing the rough edges of the work as if tidying a ward. By afternoon, they moved to the packing shed. Crates of tomatoes waited on a long table, green-shouldered and blemished from the last pickings of the season. The task was simple: sort, wipe, stack. For canning, Helen had explained, pointing to a row of cloudy glass jars. A fly buzzed near Yumi's ear. She brushed it away and reached for a crate. It slipped. The box hit the edge of the table and overturned. Tomatoes spilled, bursting wetly on the rough boards. Red pulp splashed her hands, streaked her wrists, dotted the front of her faded dress. For a second, the shed vanished. She smelled carbolic and burned canvas, heard the slap of bare feet on a hospital tent floor, saw a boy's arm slick with blood under her fingers. Her body went still, breath caught halfway. "Hey," a voice said softly. Helen was there, not close, just within reach. Her eyes flicked from Yumi's stained hands to her face, reading something in the stillness. Yumi forced her fingers to move. She picked up a crushed tomato, dropped it into the waste bucket. Another. The red smeared darkening, turning to a sticky film. "Those can go to the hogs," Helen said after a moment, as if nothing had happened. She bent, started gathering the fallen fruit. Yumi wiped her palms on the rag, feeling the skin sting. The border between shed and tent, Indiana and Saipan, felt thinner now, like paper held too close to a flame. On Sunday, the farm put on its quiet clothes. Raymond brushed the dust from his only good suit, wincing as he bent his bad knee. Helen buttoned her navy dress, the one that had grown a little loose since the telegram. She pinned her hair up, smoothed it once in the hall mirror, and tried not to look at the Gold Star flag hanging there, catching her reflection in its glass. The church sat on a low rise beyond town, white clapboards and a steeple that seemed too small for the sky. Inside, the air held the mingled smells of floor wax, damp wool coats, and old paper. Hymnals thumped open along the pews. Children's whispering died as the organ began its thin, determined prelude. Helen slid into her usual spot halfway back. Heads bent as the pastor led prayer for our boys still overseas, those missing, those in hospital beds. Names rolled out: Philippines, Okinawa, a cousin lost off Lady. She felt each place like a push between the ribs. After the sermon, he cleared his throat. "In these days," he said, "when the war is over, but not yet over inside us, we must remember the words of our Lord. Love your enemies." The phrase hung in the still air. No one said amen. On the steps afterward, the talk loosened. "You still got those Japs out on your place?" a deacon asked too loudly. "For now," Helen answered. "You be careful you don't get too soft," his wife added. "Folks talk, after what they did at Pearl." Helen watched a little cluster form, voices dropping, eyes sliding toward her and away. The words about enemies and love scraped against the memory of Yumi's frozen stare over the spilled tomatoes, of her own son's picture on the mantel in a Marine uniform. Driving home, fields sliding past the truck windows, the sermon would not leave her. Love your enemies. Or at least, she thought grimly, thank them properly if they ever save something of yours you can't afford to. The day had settled into its usual sounds, the scrape of shovels, the soft thud of hay bales pushed along the loft, the steady grunts of hogs below. Dust sifted down in thin streams whenever someone moved overhead. Yumi worked near the barn door, sweeping the feed that had spilled from the troughs into a pile for the next round. Above, boots shuffled on the planks. Someone laughed, one of the local farmhands, the younger one who whistled war songs under his breath. A moment later, the laugh broke off in a shout. The crash came like a dropped crate, only heavier. A body thudded onto the packed earth not 10 feet from where Yumi stood. Hay burst around him in a dull golden cloud. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the boy screamed. His forearm lay at an angle that was wrong, his sleeve torn open on a protruding nail from the lower ladder rung. Blood soaked the cotton, darkening fast, dripping to the dirt in thick, bright drops. His free hand clawed at the air. "Jesus!" the MP swore, half raising his carbine as if it could help. Helen was there an instant later, skirts brushing the straw, her face gone gray. "Ray!" she shouted toward the house. "Get the doctor! Now!" No one reached for the first aid kit hanging on its nail by the door. Yumi's body moved before her thoughts did. She crossed the distance, dropping to her knees beside the boy. The smell hit her, iron and sweat, sharp as any wound back on the island. Her hand shook once, then steadied. She yanked her handkerchief from her pocket, folded it tight, pressed it hard above the worst of the tearing. "Hold," she said in Japanese to the woman nearest her, grabbing the girl's wrist and pushing it into place so the pressure stayed. "Hey, don't," the MP began, but Helen's voice cut across his. "Let her," she snapped. "She knows what she's doing." The metal first aid tin was cold in Yumi's hand. Inside, gauze, a brown bottle that reeked of iodine when she twisted the cap, triangular bandages folded like dull flags. Her fingers remembered the order. Clean as best you can. Cover, bind, splint. The boy's breath hitched as the iodine touched raw skin. She murmured something without meaning to, a half prayer in a language no one here knew, and wrapped the gauze tight until the blood slowed to a dull seep. By the time the black Ford skidded into the yard and the country doctor strode in with his leather bag, the bleeding had stopped. The arm was bandaged and splinted with 2 straight boards ripped from a broken crate. The doctor knelt, checked the pulse at the boy's wrist, then looked up at Helen and the MP. "Who did this?" he asked. There was a pause. Helen's eyes went to Yumi. "She did," Helen said. "The Japanese nurse." The word settled over Yumi like dust, nurse, as if Saipan had never ended. The boy went home with his arm in a proper plaster cast and a bottle of pills in his mother's purse. By evening, the barn had gone back to its usual smells, but the air around the farm felt different, as if something invisible had been moved from one shelf to another. On the porch, Raymond lit a cigarette and watched the POW truck rattle away in the dusk. "You did right, letting her in there," he said quietly. "Still, he's going to be telling folks in town a Jap girl saved his hide." Helen folded her arms against the chill. "He'd have bled out if she hadn't," she answered. "What I'm supposed to do? Pretend that didn't happen?" Raymond drew on the cigarette, exhaled slowly. "I'm saying people won't like it. They think those prisoners already get 3 meals and a dry bed. You start making a fuss over them." "It's not fuss," she cut in. "It's thanks." The next morning she drove to the camp alone, the truck's engine humming under her feet, The administrative building smelled of old paper and stale coffee. A corporal at a metal desk took her name, then waved her toward a door marked with a major's name. The commandant was thinner than she expected, sleeves rolled to the elbow, tie loosened. He looked tired before she started speaking. "A supervised meal?" he repeated, fingers drumming on an olive drab folder. "Mrs. Miller, these are enemy nationals. We provide humane treatment. That's all the convention calls for." "She saved one of my men's arms," Helen said. "If he can keep working, that's food in the ground next year. I'd like to say thank you in my own house, with a guard present. That's all." The typewriter in the outer office clacked, a steady insect sound. The major glanced toward the noise, then back at her. "One meal," he said finally. "You understand? No gifts, no letters. An MP in the room. I don't want this becoming precedent." She left with a folded sheet of paper in her hand, the words "Supervised Meal and Appreciation" stamped across it in purple ink. That afternoon, back at the barn, the interpreter relayed the news. An invitation, dinner, house. Yumi listened, hands motionless on the broom handle. The other women murmured, eyes widening. Dinner in the enemy's house. It sounded like something from a story told to scare children. Or from a world where the war had never happened at all. The paper from the camp, with its purple stamp, lay on the kitchen table like another piece of ration paperwork. Helen set it aside and opened the metal box that held her coupons, small, colored rectangles of authority over sugar, meat, gasoline. She counted slowly. Ground beef would stretch if she mixed in breadcrumbs and an egg. Ketchup she had. There was just enough sugar left to glaze the top and sweeten a Jell-O salad with canned pineapple she'd been saving. White bread waited in its waxed paper, sliced thin. By late afternoon, the house was a sequence of tasks. Raymond dragged the spare table in from the porch, its legs scraping the floor. Helen polished the everyday silver until the dull metal caught the weak autumn light. She laid plates in careful pairs, knife to the right, fork to the left, as if proper placement could hold everything in place. "Need chairs?" a neighbor had asked earlier that week, voice tight. Then, "We're short ourselves," before Helen could answer. Now she pulled mismatched chairs from every room, evening out the wobble with folded cardboard under one leg. At camp, a different kind of preparation was underway. An MP dropped a small cardboard box on the bunk nearest Yumi. Inside lay a bar of pale, perfumed soap, wrapped in paper with looping English letters. "For Sunday," the interpreter said, "house, you, clean." His smile was awkward, eyes flicking away. In the washroom, the women lined up at the chipped porcelain sinks. Cold water bit at Yumi's fingers as she worked the soap into a lather. The scent rose, powdery, floral, nothing like the harsh GI issue blocks that smelled of lye. She scrubbed at the faint stains of iodine and tomato on her wrists until the skin throbbed. The face in the spotted mirror looked back at her, hair slicked neat, collar of the issued dress pressed as flat as she could make it. Not a nurse in a field tent, not a citizen at home, something in between. On the Miller farm, Helen slid the formed loaf into the enamel roasting pan, smoothed bottled ketchup over the top in a scarlet sheen, and pushed it into the preheated oven. The gas flame answered with a soft roar. Soon the kitchen filled with the thick, sweet smell of cooking meat and sugar, curling into the corners of the house like a promise and a dare. The farmhouse looked different from this angle. Yumi stood at the bottom of the porch steps. The other women clustered behind her, an MP on either side like bookends. The white paint, cracked in places, glowed faintly in the early evening light. From inside came the muffled clink of dishes, the soft thud of footsteps, crossing wood. Helen opened the door. The smell hit first. Warmth, starch, something tangy under it all. "Come in," she said, stepping back. The interpreter repeated in Japanese, but the meaning was clear enough from her gesture. Yumi climbed the steps, feeling the boards flex under her weight, and stepped across the threshold. The entryway was small, walls lined with coats. A faded rug muted their footsteps. To the right, a doorway opened into the dining room. The table had been stretched with an extra leaf, mismatched chairs pulled close. Plates were set in precise order, silverware glinting. On the far wall, a framed square of cloth with a single gold star hung above a sideboard. Beneath it stood a photograph, a young man in a dark green uniform, cap set at an angle, eyes squinting slightly against some long-ago sun. The eagle, globe, and anchor of the Marines gleamed small on his collar. Yumi's steps faltered. The face was unfamiliar, but the cut of the jacket, the way he held his shoulders, belonged to men she had seen on stretchers, blood soaking those same seams. "Please, sit," Helen said. They took their places awkwardly. Yumi found herself midway down the table, across from Raymond. The MP stood near the doorway, carbine leaning against his leg like another guest with its own place. Helen folded her hands. "We say grace first," she murmured, mostly to the women, though she knew they would not catch the words. Heads bowed up and down the table. Yumi, uncertain, inclined hers as well. The pastor's phrases from Sunday were different in this house, pared down to simple thanks for food, for safety, for those not with us. The last words pressed the air thinner. When they lifted their heads, the room seemed even smaller. Bowls of mashed potatoes, a plate of soft white bread, a shallow dish of pale lettuce drowned in thick white dressing waited between them. Yumi watched the others, mimicking the way they held their forks, the way they tore bread with careful fingers. The wall clock ticked, each second a small wooden knock. "I'll bring the main dish," Helen said, rising. She disappeared into the kitchen. A breath later, the smell thickened. Meat and sugar, heat and something sharp. It rolled into the dining room like a low, invisible wave. Yumi's stomach tightened, not from hunger, but from a sense that whatever came through that doorway next would not be just food. Helen carried the pan in with both hands, the heat rising through the thin towel. The meatloaf sat solid in its metal cradle, ketchup glaze shining dark red under the light. As she set it down, the table trembled just enough to make the water in the glasses shiver. For a moment, no one spoke. The smell folded over the room. Beef, onions, sugar cooked almost to caramel. Yumi felt it settle at the back of her throat, thick and foreign. Helen picked up the carving knife. Its wooden handle was worn, smooth where fingers had pressed it for years. She cut the first slice with care, the blade scraping softly against the tin. The glazed top cracked, oozing red down the brown sides. She placed the slice on Yumi's plate. Up close, the ketchup gleamed brighter, streaking onto the mashed potatoes in a red smear. Yumi's hand tightened around the fork. The room had gone very quiet. Even the clock seemed to hold its breath between ticks. She watched Helen cut more slices, heard the dull clink of knife on pan, the soft thud of meat on china. When no one moved to eat, Raymond cleared his throat, speared a piece, and took a bite. The MP shifted his weight by the doorway, carbine butt resting on the floor. Yumi cut off a small corner. The glaze stuck to the tines, stringing a little as she lifted it. She put it in her mouth. Sweetness hit first, sugar and vinegar, and something metallic. For a second, it was burned syrup in a field tent, boiled to cover other smells. Her jaw wanted to lock. She forced herself to chew. "E." The word slipped out, a breath. "Am I?" Too sweet. She hadn't meant to say it aloud. Heat rose in her face. Helen paused, knife hovering over the pan. Her eyes searched Yumi's, caught the flicker of distress more than the meaning. "Well then, honey," she said, the corner of her mouth twitching. "Put a little fire on it." She reached for the small tin of black pepper, set it beside Yumi's plate, and nudged the serving dish back toward her. The offer sat there, simple as a tool. Yumi looked at the pepper, at Helen's hand withdrawing, at the photo of the Marine on the wall. Slowly she cut another slice. The first bite had not improved with memory, but she lifted the tin, shook a dusting of dark grains over the red glaze, and took it into her mouth. The sweetness was still there, but the sharp heat slid in alongside it, changing the shape without erasing it. Across the table, Helen let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Someone, she couldn't tell who, gave a small, startled laugh. It was gone almost at once, smothered by the ticking clock and the quiet clink of forks, but Yumi heard it and knew she would not forget the sound. By Monday, the story had left the farmhouse. At the general store, between sacks of feed and jars of penny candy, someone mentioned seeing the MP truck parked longer than usual outside the Miller place on Sunday. By Tuesday, the version included a table set like Christmas and prisoners treated better than some folks' own kin. By Wednesday, Helen heard, secondhand, that she'd served pie. She hadn't had enough sugar for pie. The summons to camp came on Thursday. A short note folded into Raymond's hand by an MP. Helen drove in alone again, the ruts in the road more familiar this time. The major didn't offer her a seat. "Mrs. Miller," he said, fingers steepled on the blotter, "I've received inquiries." The words sounded like gnats. "About your meal." "It was approved," she replied, feeling the paper's ghost weight in her memory. "It was," he conceded. "And the convention calls for humane treatment." His gaze sharpened. "But it does not call for extras. You understand me? There's men in town who lost sons. They don't take kindly to hearing you had Japanese in your dining room." He didn't mention disciplinary action. There was no form on the desk, no pen uncapped. "I'll note," he added, "that this kind of thing is not encouraged and won't be repeated." On the farm, little changed and everything did. The POW truck arrived at the same time. The women climbed down, eyes darting once toward the house before settling back on the barn. The MP that day, a different one, muttered to his partner, "Heard they got themselves a fancy supper already. Spoiled, if you ask me." Yumi heard the tone, if not the words. In the packing shed, she found the tomato crates waiting just as before. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, sort, wipe, stack, but somewhere between the splintered wood and the fruit, she felt the shape of the dining room pressing in. The sweet smoke smell of the meatloaf came back so sharply she almost turned to look for it. That night in the barracks, another rumor circulated in low voices. No more dinners, no more invitations. Whatever had happened at the farm was done. Yumi lay on her bunk, eyes on the dark rafters. The memory of the table, of the pepper's sting on her tongue, sat in her like a small, hard stone, too insignificant for the great machinery of war to notice, too heavy for her to ignore. The order came in late winter, printed on thin paper that crinkled in the camp clerk's hands, repatriation. Names were read in batches. Men first, mostly. Then one morning, a smaller list. The interpreter's voice caught slightly over the unfamiliar syllables of women's names, but they were called all the same. Yumi stood in line with a duffel bag that was not quite hers, a U.S. canvas sack issued for the journey, half filled with folded clothes and the few possessions she was allowed to keep. The air at the rail yard tasted of coal and cold metal. Beyond the low buildings, a stripe of water showed where the ship waited, gray against gray sky. "Single file," an officer called. The line inched forward. Near the gate, a small commotion rippled. A civilian woman was arguing with an MP, voice tight. "I just want to see her," Helen said. "1 minute." "Ma'am, you can't." The officer nearby glanced over, weighed the trouble of saying yes against the trouble of saying no, and made a small, impatient gesture. "Make it quick." Helen slipped past the barrier. The POWs stared, then looked away. She scanned the line, found Yumi by the curve of her shoulders. For a moment, they simply faced each other, the noise of the yard pressing around them. Helen's coat was buttoned crooked. Yumi noticed that before anything else. Helen began, then stopped. The words between them were too few. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, folded index card, edges softened by handling. Blue ink covered one side in careful block letters. She took Yumi's hand, turned the palm up, and set the card on it, curling the fingers closed. "Thank you," Helen said. The interpreter, catching up, offered a clumsy Japanese version, "arigato," but it was hardly needed. Yumi nodded once. The MP touched Helen's elbow. She stepped back, then was gone, swallowed by coats and uniforms. Hours later, on the troopship's crowded deck, with gulls wheeling and the harbor sliding away, Yumi unfolded the card. The letters marched neatly down the page, meatloaf, breadcrumbs, onion egg, and, near the bottom, underlined twice, ketchup glaze. She traced the line with her thumb. The words meant little by themselves. She knew the tastes better than the language. Somewhere below, the engines throbbed, carrying them all toward a country she had not seen in years and could not picture whole. She folded the card and tucked it into the seam of her canvas bag, where it would not be lost easily. The sweetness of the glaze rose in her memory, unwelcome and undeniable, chased by the rough bite of black pepper. On the gray water, with no kitchen in sight, she could not imagine ever cooking such a thing. But as the shoreline thinned to a smudge and the wind salted her lips, she understood that whatever she became next, the taste of that table, in all its wrongness and mercy, would travel with her.